From New York, this is Democracy Now!
The establishment of Israeli civilian settlements in the West Bank is not, per se, inconsistent with international law.
In an abrupt reversal, the Trump administration's announced it no longer views Israeli settlements in the occupied West Bank to be a violation of international law. We'll get the latest. But first, as South Bend Mayor Pete Buttigieg soars in the polls in Iowa, close to 10 points ahead of the other candidates, we'll look at why some believe the primary order is racist. I recently posed the question to Senator Elizabeth Warren. Two of the whitest states in the country, and then we moved to South Carolina with a very significant population of people of color. And it means the candidates spend so much of their time catering to those first two states. Overall, do you think that should change?
Look, I'm just a player in the game on this one, and I am delighted to be in South Carolina.
And we'll speak to Bolivia's ambassador to the United Nations. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In a sharp reversal of more than 40 years of U.S. policy, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has announced the United States no longer views Israeli settlements in the occupied West Bank to be a violation of international law, despite a 2016 UN resolution declaring the settlements a flagrant violation of international law. Monday's announcement sparked widespread condemnation from Palestinians. This is Chief Palestinian Negotiator Saeb Erekat.
Colonial settlements in the occupied Palestinian territories, including East Jerusalem, are not only illegal under international law, they are war crimes. And the statement of Mr. Pompeo, the Secretary of State of the United States, is absolutely rejected and must be condemned.
Soon after Secretary of State Mike Pompeo announced the new U.S. policy, the U.S. Embassy in Israel issued a travel warning to Americans in Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza. We'll have more on the Israeli settlements and Pompeo's announcement after headlines. We'll speak with Palestinian human rights attorney, legal scholar Noura Erakat. On Capitol Hill, 4 witnesses are slated to testify today as part of the televised impeachment hearings into whether President Trump withheld military aid from Ukraine to pressure the Ukrainian president to investigate Trump's political rival, Joe Biden, and his son. This morning, congressional lawmakers will hear testimony from Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, the top Ukraine expert for the National Security Council, and Jennifer Williams, a special advisor to Vice President Mike Pence and a member of the National Security Council staff. Both Vindman and Williams listened in on the July 25th phone call between President Trump and Ukrainian President Zelensky, which is at the center of the impeachment inquiry. In earlier closed-door testimony, Vindman said the White House transcript of the July 25th phone call omitted key words and phrases, including an explicit mention of Burisma Holdings by the Ukrainian president. Trump was trying to pressure the president to publicly announce an investigation into Joe Biden and his son Hunter and his role on Burisma's board. Vindman also testified his attempts to include the omissions in the transcript failed. In her previous testimony, Jennifer Williams called the July 25th phone call between Trump and the Ukrainian president unusual and inappropriate. This afternoon, the 2 witnesses to testify will be former U.S. Special Envoy to Ukraine Kurt Volker and former National Security Council official Timothy Morrison. In a now-released text message, Volker wrote to one of President Zelensky's aides only hours before the July 25th phone call, writing, quote, "Heard from the White House, assuming President Z convinces Trump he will investigate, get to the bottom of what happened in 2016, will nail down date for visit to Washington," unquote. Timothy Morrison had been the top Russia staffer on the National Security Council until he resigned last month ahead of his closed-door testimony in the impeachment hearings. Morrison also listened in on the July 25th phone call, later said he thought it could be damaging to U.S.-Ukrainian relations. He's also said he was surprised to learn the call's transcript was put on a top-secret server, which many say was part of a White House cover-up. These 4 testimonies today come after House Democrats released the transcript of the closed-door testimony of David Holmes, a senior political officer at the U.S. Embassy in Kiev. He told lawmakers Ukrainian officials came to understand what was required to access U.S. military aid in a meeting with President Trump. Holmes is slated to testify Thursday. On Monday, President Trump said he was strongly considering providing a written testimony as part of the ongoing impeachment inquiry. Democracy Now! Will be live streaming the impeachment hearings in full at democracynow.org. The United Nations has condemned the United States for having the world's highest rate of children in detention. The UN experts particularly condemned the Trump administration's policy of forcibly separating children from their parents at the border, then detaining children away from their parents or family members. This is Manfred Nowak, who is leading the UN Global Study on Children Deprived of Liberty.
Of course, separating children, as was done by the Trump administration, from their parents and even small children at the Mexican-U.S. border is absolutely prohibited by the Convention on the Rights of the Child. I would call it inhuman treatment for both the parents and the children. And there are still quite a number of children that are separated from their parents and where neither the children know where the parents are, nor the parents know where their children are.
Thousands marched across Bolivia Monday to demand the resignation of Janine Áñez, the right-wing senator who declared herself president of Bolivia last week after longtime socialist President Evo Morales resigned in what he and others have condemned as a military coup. The political crisis in Bolivia has sparked nationwide violence with at least 23 dead, including 9 people shot dead by the military at an indigenous pro-Morales march in Cochabamba Friday. In more news from Bolivia, indigenous Bolivian family members are in Miami today for a hearing urging the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals to reinstate a $10 million judgment finding Bolivia's former president, Gonzalo Sánchez de Lozada, liable for the massacre of more than 60 unarmed indigenous people in 2003. Later in the broadcast, we'll speak to Bolivia's ambassador to the United Nations. In Afghanistan, the Afghan government and the Taliban have carried out a prisoner exchange, freeing American professor Kevin King and Australian professor Timothy Weeks. Both had been professors at the American University of Afghanistan before being kidnapped in Kabul in 2016. In exchange, the Afghan government freed 3 senior Taliban members, Anas Haqqani, Hafiz Rashid, and Haji Malikan. In Hong Kong, dozens of student protesters remain inside Hong Kong Polytechnic University, which has been besieged by police for days. Over 1,000 students have been arrested as part of the siege. Many of the protesters were forced to surrender after being injured by police firing rubber bullets and tear gas. Others escaped by rappelling down a bridge and fleeing on waiting motorcycles. The standoff at the prestigious university is a dramatic escalation of the protests, which began in June. On Tuesday, Beijing also condemned a Hong Kong court's decision Monday to overturn a ban on face masks worn by the protesters. Beijing accused the Hong Kong judiciary of blatantly challenging the authority of China. In China, a gas explosion inside a coal mine has killed 15 workers, injured another 9 in the province of Shaanxi. Last year, a review of the mine found it failed to provide adequate training for workers. China's mines are the deadliest in the world, accounting for about 80% of mining deaths worldwide. The Chinese mining explosion came on the heels of a gas pipeline explosion in Bangladesh Sunday, which killed 7 people, hospitalized another 25 southeast of the capital of Dhaka. Brazil's National Institute for Space Research warns deforestation of the Amazon has skyrocketed since the election of the far-right Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro. Between August 2018 and July 2019, the Amazon rainforest in Brazil lost an area of about 12 times the size of New York City, a 30% increase since the previous year and the highest total loss of rainforest habitat since 2008. Syracuse University has suspended all fraternity activities for the rest of the fall semester, following a pattern of anti-Semitic and racist incidents on campus. On Saturday, an African-American student was verbally harassed and called a racial slur by a group of fellow students, including members of a fraternity. This according to a statement from the university. This is the 6th time there are reports involving racist language and symbols at Syracuse University in the last 10 days. This month alone, there have been at least 10 racist incidents reported on or near campus, including a swastika drawn in a dorm hall and other vandalism featuring racial slurs targeting Black and Asian people. In New York, 4 students at Columbia University with the global nonviolent action movement Extinction Rebellion launched a 5-day hunger strike Monday. The students are demanding Columbia declare a climate emergency and pursue a community-led process to divest from fossil fuels. Over 400 people in 30 countries are participating in similar hunger strikes with Extinction Rebellion across the globe. Former NFL San Francisco 49ers star quarterback Colin Kaepernick held a workout Saturday at the Charles Drew High School south of Atlanta in front of NFL scouts and members of the media. Kaepernick's workout came after a week of contentious negotiations with the NFL, which Kaepernick has accused of blackballing him for taking the knee during the national anthem as a protest against police violence and racism. Kaepernick's move sparked racial justice protests that swept across the NFL and other major professional sports leagues, but resulted in him not being signed by a single NFL team and being out of the league for 3 years. On Saturday, Kaepernick refused to participate in the NFL's hastily arranged workout, which was to be closed to the press. Instead, he went to the nearby high school and held his own workout, which one of the NFL scouts called impressive. And in New York City, hundreds of farm workers and their family members and allies marched to the Manhattan offices of Trian Partners, one of the largest shareholders of the fast food giant Wendy's. The farm workers are demanding Wendy's sign on to the Fair Food Program, which would require the fast food giant purchase tomatoes from growers that follow a worker-designed code of conduct that includes a zero-tolerance policy for sexual harassment and abuse in the fields. Wendy's is the only major fast food chain that's refused to sign on to the Fair Food Program. This is comedian Amy Schumer speaking at the rally Monday.
And you are not alone. Even actors and comedians here in New York and Hollywood, all around the United States, know about your struggle. And you're fighting for your children. I know a lot of your own family members have struggled in the fields and at work. And we're with you. And we're going to fight and bring more and more awareness to this fight. There's no excuse for Wendy's having not joined the Fair Food Program.
To see our full coverage of the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, go to democracynow.org. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our viewers and listeners across the country and around the world. Thousands marched across Bolivia on Monday to demand the resignation of Janine Áñez, the right-wing senator who declared herself president of Bolivia last week after longtime socialist President Evo Morales resigned under pressure from the military. The coup d'etat has thrown Bolivia into crisis with violence across the country, leaving at least 23 dead. On Friday, the military gunned down 9 pro-Morales protesters outside Cochabamba, where indigenous people took to the streets again on Monday. Thousands more marched to the presidential palace in La Paz. Self-proclaimed President Áñez canceled the trip to her home province after receiving a death threat. The wave of protests are condemning the spike in anti-indigenous violence under the interim president and demanding the return of Evo Morales. Áñez has a history of using racist, anti-indigenous language and has vowed to bring the Bible back to the presidency. Last week, she issued a decree protecting the military from prosecution for any violent acts and said that Morales would face prosecution himself if he returned to Bolivia.
Evo Morales is Bolivia's first indigenous president. Bolivia has a majority indigenous population. He spoke to Al Jazeera from Mexico, where he fled after his ouster.
I am absolutely convinced that these violent groups are bringing racism back. And racism turns into fascism. They burned union buildings, the houses of my comrades. They attacked the house of my sister. They looted my own house.
Well, for more, we're joined by Sasha Llorente, the Bolivian ambassador to the United Nations, president of the First Committee of the UN General Assembly. He's speaking to us by phone. We welcome you to Democracy Now! Ambassador Llorente, we don't know where you are. Do you fear for your safety?
Well, I think that all Bolivians do right now. There is a systematic persecution being directed by the ones that took power through violent means. Allow me to say good morning to you all also. I mean, those were not just threats. Who is now running the Minister of Government, who is the Interior Minister, has threatened to hand down members of MAS, of the movement towards socialism, like animals. That's what he said. But not just that, but also the woman who is in charge of the Minister of Communication, she said that she will persecute journalists, or pseudo-journalists, as she put it, because they were committing acts of sedition. And those were not just threats, Amy, but if you read the report of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, they reported that so far 23 people were killed, and more than 700 are wounded. So we are going through not just a coup d'etat, but a violent one, and they are continue using violence against peaceful demonstrations. One issue that is of our concern, and I think the international community has a common position on that, is that this dictatorship, they issue a decree. It's called a supreme decree that allows the military to act with impunity. This decree says that the military is able to conduct their operations, so to speak, and without any fear of a legal procedure or for them not to be accountable. So I think that people in my country is of course afraid, as President Morales also said in the interview that you just showed. Not just members of our political party are being persecuted, not just members of the legislative body are persecuted, but also social leaders. Many houses were burned to ashes, and they are. There's some members of Evo's cabinet who are in asylum in embassies or had to flee to exile. So it is like going back to the 70s, really, Amy.
Well, Ambassador Llorente, I wanted to ask you, a lot is still not known in terms of details of what happened in the hours or days before President Morales resigned. Have you been able to talk with him and get a better sense of what happened? Because clearly there was a public announcement of the military that they recommended that he step down, but at that point, as far as the rest of the world knows, there was no direct activity by the military. Could you talk about if you've had conversations with him, what you know about why he decided to resign and leave the country?
Well, Juan, this was a very well-planned coup because there were many factors that are being disclosed right now. I had the chance to talk many times with President Morales, who's still the president, by the way. Constitutionally speaking, we can get to that later. But what happened was that first it was, as you know, the police and the military are the two institutions that have weapons, that are armed in Bolivia. The first one that joined the coup was the police. At the beginning, they refused to comply with the instructions of President Morales' government. But then, after, they joined the demonstrators against the government. That was one part of the armed coup. The second part was, even after President Morales publicly said that he's willing to call for new elections, to elect a new electoral body, and with new political actors, meaning that he will not be running on those elections. Even when he said that, not just the chief of the Bolivian armed forces, but also of the police, recommended him to resign. But when someone that has weapons recommend you to do something, it's a threat. But even beyond that, Juan and Amy, this goes, to the safety of President Morales. Once, even before he resigned, all his security was dismantled. He couldn't use the presidential plane, and some loyal members of his security team showed him messages in which people were offering them $50,000 if they would hand him over. And there are videos that you can see that the police was hunting him down even before his resignation, and it was worse after his resignation. Beyond that, when Mexico offered him asylum, the Bolivian military did not allow the Mexican plane to leave the country. Not just that, they didn't allow the Mexican plane to fly over Bolivian airspace. So there are many, many factors. And just for me, I think this is very important. But once the self-proclaimed president, Senator Áñez, in his first interview, he thanked the police. She thanked the police, and she said that they will comply with all the offers they were given. I mean the police was given all the offers that were given. So it was clearly a coup d'état run by the right-wing politicians and the eastern elite of Bolivia, but also by the police and the military.
I wanted to play some of those who are talking about the Sacaba massacre. The Andean Information Network interviewed more than 24 witnesses of the massacre in Bolivia Friday, speaking with the Institute of Forensic Investigations, and viewed the death certificates of those murdered. The witnesses did not want to be identified by their name out of fear for their safety. This is one of them.
They are saying the people from the MAS are attacking, but this is not true. They have come peacefully, and the journalists of Bolivia are not talking with people from here because they know they are going to tell the truth, and they do not want to unveil the truth. We are just asking for peace for Bolivia, please. We do not want more dead. We do not want more sadness. You can see by yourself how many people have died.
And this is another demonstrator in Sacaba speaking just after the massacre on Friday.
I want to share my concerns with these police officers that had sold themselves to the ones that have the money, Camacho and Mesa. They are shooting us with helicopters, like if they were at war. But they never had this war when Evo was president. But they are sending bullets and helicopters and tanks against us now. Today we have almost 5 or 7 people dead.
So it looks like there's at least 9 people dead, over 100 injured, and you have the self-proclaimed president of Bolivia, Janine Áñez, previously calling indigenous communities satanic, declaring her presidency will bring the Bible back to Bolivia. Bolivian Ambassador Sacha Llorente, can you respond to who Janine Áñez is? And what is your role right now? I mean, can you walk into the consulate in New York where you resided?
Well, first of all, this is there's an elite, mainly in the eastern part of the country, with a lot of money. That in 2008, you might remember, Amy, they wanted to split the country. They wanted to, they started a movement of secession of that part of the country. It's powerful people that were directly affected by Evo Morales' policies, mainly in terms of land, of the administration of other natural resources, and also the banks. So it is not just Senator Áñez, but behind her there is a class. There are economic interests. They already started different policies that want to restore neoliberalism in Bolivia. I'm going to give you one example. They want to privatize some of the endeavors that Evo Morales built during the last 14 years, and they want to get rid of all the regulations for exports in Bolivia. We used to regulate exports in order to keep the prices low in Bolivia and to guarantee that everyone gets those products in the country. But now they are getting rid of those regulations in order for them to get more, profit, mainly. So there is a clear economic project by these people. It is not just this senator that is now the self-proclaimed president of my country. There is a real path to destroy all the things that we have achieved in the past 14 years. That's one thing. The second thing is that it is a racist elite. One of the first things they've done in not just in one place, in different cities in Bolivia, they burned down the huipala. That's the indigenous flag. I remember that they've done that in 2008, and the UN clearly stated that was a racist act because that is an indigenous symbol that is also recognized by the Constitution adopted in 2009. So we are talking about an economic plan. They do have an economic project. They do have a social project, which is, the restoration of these racist ways of running the state. But at the same time, they are aligned with the policies of the White House. The first things that they've done is to recognize the other self-proclaimed president of Venezuela, Guaidó. They expel all the Venezuelan diplomats, and they expel the medical workers, the Cuban medical workers, the Cuban staff that help a great deal in terms of reaching the more isolated communities in Bolivia. So this is what's happening, and it's not surprised that one of the first countries that recognized Senator Áñez was precisely the United States.
Well, Ambassador Llorente, we only have a couple of minutes, but I wanted to ask you two questions. Wonder if you could respond to them briefly. One is, what's been the response of the international community? Because clearly the self-proclaimed president, as I understand it, has fired most of the ambassadors that President Morales appointed around the world. How are they reacting to that, to those orders? And also, you're looking back at the original unrest under President Morales as a result of his decision to continue to run for another term, even though it was against the original referendum that he supported of term limits. Your sense of whether any mistakes were made by the movement that he's a part of?
Well, answer to your first question, Juan, I think that most part of the international community is is looking closely to what's happening. They are really concerned about, for example, that decree that gives impunity to the military, and they want fair elections. I think that the Inter-American Human Rights Commission, the Michelle Bachelet as the High Commissioner for Human Rights, I mean, they stress that very, very clearly. There are many governments that are not recognizing that one. There's just a handful that have. And I think that the only way in which we could solve this problem is through negotiation in order to have transparent elections and with the full participation of the movement towards socialism. And they have to guarantee that, and also they have to stop the repression and persecution. And your other question about was mistakes. I think that, of course, I mean, we made mistakes. The process of change, as it's called, the Bolivian Revolution, was made by human beings. And we made many mistakes along the way, but there were great successes, Juan. I mean, we have reduced poverty like no other, from 38% of extreme poverty to 15%. We have raised the quality of millions of people that now are part of the middle class, and in parentheses, many of them are now protesting against the government that set all those the conditions for them to improve in their lives. And also in terms of child mortality, to protect. You know that Bolivia is the according to the World Economic Forum, is the 17th country in the world in terms of reducing gender gap. The 17th, way behind many European countries, because there were policies directed to that goal. So we've done, of course, there were mistakes, but I think that many good things were done
Ambassador
correctly.
Llorente, we only have 30 seconds. Do you think the U.S. was involved with the coup?
I mean, I think that the OAS is the pawn of the United States government, and of course they were involved. They were part of the coup, and also they acted in coordination with the calendar of the coup.
And were you fired?
Well, they tried to fire me, but they can't, because I'm recognized by the Credentials Committee of the United Nations. I'm still the ambassador of Bolivia to the United Nations. I will not recognize that dictatorship, and I'll continue to do my job in the best of my capacity.
Do you think the president would be killed if he went to Bolivia?
They would try. They try to kill him. They try to him for sure. And he saved his life because of he was protected by peasants in Cochabamba.
Sacha Llorente, I want to thank you for being with us, Bolivian ambassador to the United Nations, president of the First Committee of the UN General Assembly. When we come back, in an abrupt reversal, the Trump administration announces it no longer views Israeli settlements in the occupied West Bank to be a violation of international law. Stay with us.
La revolución industrial ahora viene y viene con más fuerza que la industrial. Millones de cabezas que pusieron bajo tierra fueron semilla y como flor ahora crecen. Como flor ahora crecen. Va a alumbrar la mente de las gentes presentes que olvidaron el sentido natural, el respeto al ancestro, al abuelo, a la abuela. A estos la Pachamama se los va a tragar. Se los va a tragar. Es la revolución india astral. La India al poder, esto seguro te va a joder. Es la revolución india astral. El sol hoy brilla más, Babilonia se va a quemar. Es la revolución india astral. La India al poder, el sistema va a caer. El poder, el rencor, la ira y la envidia, el abuso, el racismo y la intimidación está acercándose a ti, se está adueñando de ti.
Tahoe. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
In a sharp reversal of more than 40 years of U.S. policy, the Trump administration has announced it no longer views Israeli settlements in the occupied West Bank to be a violation of international law. In 1978, the State Department issued a legal opinion stating that settlements were, quote, inconsistent with international law, and every administration, Democratic and Republican, has upheld that. On Monday, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo announced a reversal to the U.S. position.
The establishment of Israeli civilian settlements in the West Bank is not, per se, inconsistent with international law.
This announcement puts the U.S. at odds with the international community. In 2016, a UN resolution declared the settlements a flagrant violation of international law. Israel's embattled Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu welcomed Pompeo's announcement as a historic day for Israel, but Palestinian chief negotiator Saeb Erekat condemned the U.S. decision.
Israeli colonial settlements in the occupied Palestinian territories, including East Jerusalem, are not only illegal under international law, they are war crimes. And the statement of Mr. Pompeo, the Secretary of State of the United States, is absolutely rejected and must be condemned.
Soon after Mike Pompeo announced the new U.S. policy, the U.S. Embassy in Israel issued a travel warning to Americans in Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza. We're joined now by Noura Erakat, Palestinian human rights attorney and legal scholar, assistant professor at Rutgers University. Her latest book, Justice for Some, Law and the Question of Palestine. This is an abrupt reversal. Noura Erakat, can you talk about the significance of it?
I would actually temper that a little bit. This is not necessarily a reversal in U.S. policy, only in its stated policy. For more than 5 decades, since 1967, all U.S. administrations have talked out of both sides of their mouth. On the one hand, they have condemned settlements as counterproductive to peace and as a contravention of international law, and on the other hand, have provided Israel with the unequivocal diplomatic, military, and financial aid in order to entrench their settlements. Even the Obama administration, as it was abstaining on UN Security Council Resolution 2334, condemning the settlements as a flagrant violation, has been part of the problem. They issued that abstention only 2 weeks before they left office. Simultaneously, the Obama administration increased aid from $3 billion to $3.8 billion a year. And in 2012, that same administration used its first veto at the Security Council to condemn a resolution, a UN Security Council resolution condemning settlements using exact U.S. foreign policy language on settlements. So what we're seeing now is not a sharp reversal of U.S. foreign policy on the question of settlements and Palestine, but instead the culmination of it. For us to blame this on Trump is basically to exculpate ourselves and to create a revisionist history. Instead, we should be accountable and actually take responsibility for how we have been part of this problem.
And could you talk about the timing of this announcement in the midst of an essential stalemate in Israel in terms of a new government? And Benny Gantz has a deadline this week of forming a new government, or Israel may be forced to a third election?
Yeah, this is what's so tragic about all of this. What we're talking about right now in the West Bank is about 700,000 settlers living in the midst of a population of 3 million Palestinians who, because of those 700,000 settlers who are living on exclusive colonial settlements surrounded by military and civilian Israeli infrastructure, cuts up Palestinian life into 20 non-contiguous Bantustans where they can't reach one another. We're talking about the subjugation of a Palestinian population at the whim of these illegal colonial settlements. And now we're seeing this discussion, we're seeing the U.S. recognize this as not a violation of international law, which actually has no basis because they can't change that status. They can only be in violation of it. But the tragic part is that the U.S. administration is doing this in order to support Netanyahu in his own bid to consolidate power in Israel. Palestinians are pawns to be moved around in order to shape U.S. domestic policy. And the other thing that should be highlighted is although Netanyahu, who represents the right, is celebrating this as a culmination of his own vision, Benny Gantz and the Blue and White Party supports it and welcomes the Trump administration announcement as well. There is no daylight between the so-called Israeli left and the so-called Israeli light. What we're seeing is a consolidation of their settler colonial takings. We want to frame this as a contravention of the peace process and not acknowledging the fact that what's ongoing is a violation of human human rights, the entrenchment of an apartheid regime, and that the reversion to the peace process is precisely the problem. It was the Oslo Accords that put settlements on the back burner and made it part of the final status negotiations that we're not getting to. And so that what we're seeing now in terms of what the U.S. administration is doing is forcing Palestinians to accept every new incremental territorial taking as new facts on the ground that are then presented to Palestinian negotiators who have to accept those facts on the ground, which are war crimes, as previously stated. And when the Palestinians protest, they are told that they are the obstacle to peace. So the reversion to the peace process here, the reversion to the U.S. status quo ante on how to handle the situation, is the reversion into a straight dead end and back to where we are. We have to think about this radically anew about how to transcend this situation. This isn't about the peace process. This isn't about two states. These are about flagrant human rights violations. We are witnessing the entrenchment of an apartheid regime and the U.S. at the helm of that process.
I wanted to ask you about this move coming right after the European Union's top court ruled that European Union countries must identify products made in Israeli settlements on their labels, in a decision that was welcomed by rights groups, sparking anger in Israel. I'm reading from a Chicago Tribune piece. The European Court of Justice said when products come from an Israeli settlement, their labels must provide an indication of that provenance so that consumers can make informed choices when they shop. How do these two issues relate?
I lost sound.
Can you hear me now, Noura Erakat? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me?
I lost sound. Should I answer this question?
Okay. We're not...
Hi.
Hi, can you hear me?
Hello. Yes, I can.
Okay,
now
perfect.
I can hear you.
I'm asking you about the
European Court of Justice decision.
Yes.
Yes. So that decision is, at the very least, all that decision is doing is providing consumers with the ability to make their own choices about where they want to purchase their products. It is not banning Israeli settlement projects, despite the fact that they are a flagrant violation. It is not imposing sanctions on Israel, which is actually the obligation of third parties in relation to what's happening in the West Bank. All they are doing is labeling products. This is about a business and human rights framework. And Israel is saying that this is discriminatory and targeting Israel. And yet it's the very least the European Union should do. And this points us to the other problem. Despite the fact that the Trump administration has removed the emperor's clothes and made very clear that the U.S. is part of the problem and not an honest broker, no other state has rushed to fill the vacuum that the U.S. has left behind. Even the European Union is willing to throw money at the Palestinians in order to make their situation more tolerable, but is not interested in actually applying the pressure and the coercion upon Israel in order to change this status quo and to deliver an actual viable future. And so what they're doing right now is the very least of labeling products, when instead they should be boycotting those products altogether, applying the sanctions. And here, because Israel gets to control this conversation about this being targeted rather than it be a conversation where Israel has to defend itself, we're seeing this as somehow radical.
And speaking of pressure on Israel, the BDS movement, the enormous effort that Israel is expending all around the world to try to silence BDS supporters. Could you talk about the impact of that movement on Israeli policy?
So the BDS movement now is more relevant than ever, precisely because it's been made clear the U.S. is not an honest broker, but is a pillar of the problem. The European Union has no intention of resolving the conflict, but only of containing the conflict. There are no other diplomatic alternatives, and instead, Palestinians are expected to be held in the status quo. We have 8 Palestinians who were killed in an aerial strike in Gaza last week in the middle of the night, and yet are not asking questions about that. There was a Palestinian journalist who was shot by a sniper. His eye was shot out as he was reporting what was happening in Gaza. We still are not talking about that. And so instead, we remain in this discourse of a diplomatic intransigence and a nonsensical and farcical peace process that is actually a central part of the problem. And so what the BDS movement represents is a grassroots alternative. It is people power demonstrating their conscience and their solidarity. And for Americans and people in the United States, it is more critical than ever, precisely because we are not witnesses to what is happening to Palestinians. We are part of the problem. We are a central pillar of the problem because we provide Israel with the impunity it needs to continue its war crimes, with the funding it needs to build those settlements, and with the cover that it receives here in our political parlance. And so when we're talking about Palestine, we are not talking about a foreign policy issue. We are talking about a pillar of what the U.S. is doing. We are part of this problem the same way that we are part of separating families at the borders, the same way that we are denying access to asylum seekers, the same way that we are overseeing a mass incarceration problem that overrepresents black bodies. We are also overseeing the subjugation of Palestinians as part of our policy.
Noura Erakat, we want to thank you so much for being with us. And, of course, last year the Trump administration dropped the use of the word occupied, speaking of parlance. Noura Erakat is Palestinian human rights attorney and legal scholar, assistant professor at Rutgers University. Her latest book, Justice for Some, Law and the Question of Palestine. When we come back, as South Bend Mayor Pete Buttigieg soars in the polls in Iowa, we look at why some believe the primary system, the order of the states, the top two states, some of the most whitest in the country, why some believe the system is racist. Stay with us. Give me the flute, Hossam Hayek. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Well, as the United States becomes increasingly diverse and the Democratic Party even more so, the presidential nomination process remains heavily weighted by two states that are among the whitest in the nation, Iowa and New Hampshire.
During the first ever presidential forum on environmental justice earlier this month in South Carolina, I asked Senator Elizabeth Warren about the issue. Senator Warren, just 30 seconds left. But speaking about racial injustice, do you think the order of the primary states should change? You have Iowa and New Hampshire.
Wait, let me just, before you finish, are you actually going to ask me to sit here and criticize Iowa and New Hampshire?
No, I'm asking about the order.
No, that is what Iowa and New Hampshire
let me
are all
just
about.
ask, they're two of the whitest states in the country. And then we move to South Carolina with a very significant population of people of color. And it means the candidates spend so much of their time catering to those first two states. Overall, do you think that should change?
Look, I'm just a player in the game on this one. And I am delighted to be in South Carolina. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Senator Warren's reaction to the question echoes the Democratic Party's stance on maintaining first-in-the-nation status for both the Iowa caucus and the New Hampshire primary. In 1972, Iowa Democrats moved the caucus up to January 24th to give themselves extra time to process the results from all the precincts. That early date made the Iowa caucus's nation's first indicator of each candidate's standing, attracted extraordinary media attention. The Iowa Democratic and Republican parties agreed to hold their caucuses early and on the same day to maximize national press coverage. New Hampshire then cemented its hold as the first primary state immediately following the Iowa caucuses. Candidates in some cases spend more time, more than a year, making frequent extended campaign swings through Iowa and New Hampshire, which critics say gives the concerns of these first two states disproportionate impact on the agenda for the entire race. MSNBC played my exchange with Warren for Democratic presidential hopeful Julian Castro, who pushed back on the status quo.
I actually believe that we do need to change the order of the states, because I don't believe that that we're the same country we were in 1972. That's when Iowa first held its caucus first. And by the time we have the next presidential election in 2024, it'll have been more than 50 years since 1972. Our country has changed a lot in those 50 years. The Democratic Party has changed a lot. What I really appreciate about Iowans and the folks in New Hampshire is that they take this process very seriously. They vet the candidates. They show up at town halls. They give people a good hearing. At the same time, demographically, it's not reflective of the United States as a whole, certainly not reflective of the Democratic Party, and I believe that other states should have their chance. So yes, of course, we need to find other states, and that doesn't mean that Iowa and New Hampshire can't still play an important role, right. But I don't believe that forever we should be married to Iowa and New Hampshire going first.
In another interview with CBS, Julian Castro said, quote, "We can't say to black women, oh, thank you, you're the ones powering our victories in places like Alabama in 2018, and then turn around and start our nominating contest in 2 states that barely have any black people in them. That doesn't make sense." But Castro won't be raising this issue at Wednesday's debate in Atlanta. He didn't make the cut for this debate.
In a moment, we'll be joined by Gilberto Hinojosa, chair of the Texas Democratic Party. But first, we turn to Ian Millhiser, senior correspondent at Vox. Ian, welcome back to Democracy Now! How did this system happen? Who created this system that 2 of the whitest states in the country are the first in the primary system? And now with the extended pre-primary season, all of these candidates spend this time in Iowa and New Hampshire.
Well, I mean, as you alluded to in the intro, this wasn't something done with intentionality. You know, no one in the Democratic Party sat down and said, what are the 2 states that would be best to start off the process? It's just that Iowa and New Hampshire, jockeyed themselves to the front of the line at a time when the media started paying a lot of attention to the early races. And now that they have it, the psychological term is loss aversion. When you have something, it's you get very upset if someone tries to take it away from you. And that's the problem with this dynamic, is that there was never any planning. There was never any thought that put into, well, who makes sense to be the first state? And then once you get someone in that position, they're going to be very, very resistant if someone tries to assign that position to someone else.
Well, we're also joined by Gilberto Hinojosa, chair of the Texas Democratic Party. Welcome to Democracy Now! Could you talk to us about what the impact on a huge state like Texas, your state, is by the fact that the candidates are so focused for so much time on Iowa and New Hampshire?
Well, I mean, it's obvious. I mean, Texas is the 2nd largest state in the country. It is probably the most diverse state in the country. 40% of the population in the state is Hispanic. 15% is either African American or Asian American. We are a majority minority state, as is California and New Mexico. And yet, we have to wait until the process in Iowa and in New Hampshire completes itself. And Secretary Castro is correct. These are not 2 states that are representative in terms of ethnicity of the Democratic Party. I mean, it's like, I'm from the Rio Grande Valley of Texas. There's about 1.4 million people that live in the Rio Grande Valley. It's about 90% Latino. It's like if we would have our primary in the Rio Grande Valley of Texas and have candidates spending 3 months there continuously going to barbecues and different events that were being sponsored by the local elected officials. Nobody would think that would be a representative primary that you would have to start your election season with. And so I think this is a process that has been established through tradition. Tradition doesn't work anymore. I think it's not fair to the candidates either. I mean, they spend an enormous amount of time and money. I mean, the people go to big dinners there. Candidates go there. They have to put their supporters in the dinners. They have to pay for the supporters to be there. They end up spending thousands of dollars to get the attention in this small state of Iowa that doesn't produce the results that are reflective of what our Democratic Party represents all across America. So I think it's something that should change. At least we have to have a conversation. I've been on the Democratic National Committee for 10 years, or longer than that. And we've never had a conversation on this issue. We've never talked about whether or not Iowa and New Hampshire should be the first primaries. We were always told this is the way it is, and you just gotta have to deal with it.
In fact, the DNC chair, Tom Perez, made a deal with the Iowa delegation that he would not challenge their first status if they voted for him to be chair of the DNC. But I wanted to ask you, you told the New York Times, Gilberto Hinojosa, that you're trying to host a forum in January. You have trouble attracting a lot of the presidential candidates because they say they're too busy in Iowa.
Well, in fact, we would like to have a forum with all the candidates, and in Iowa, they're having a forum at the exact same time, and therefore the question is, are you going to, right before the caucuses, is a candidate going to come to Texas that has, the 38 electoral votes and has a heck of a lot more delegates going to the national convention, or are you going to go to Iowa that has a small number of delegates and electoral votes? Which is going to produce the most results for you? Well, because Iowa's first, people are going over there instead of this state that has much more potential for, especially, second tier, at least in terms of where they're being rated, candidates. I mean, I just think it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't help us flush out the whole process to where we could get a candidate that has a better chance of winning in November. And I just think that, we've never had this conversation before, and it's very frustrating for us. I mean, we're a state that is clearly purple now. It has been declared to be a battleground state. If Texas were to turn blue, it would be all over for the Republican Party's ability to elect a president of the United States, because we have so many electoral votes. Yet we're being placed, behind these other states and not given an opportunity to get these candidates in the state, to compete in the state, and to be able to come out with the delegates that helps them go in the direction of being able to get the nomination.
I'd like to ask Ian Millhiser, this whole issue of whether this is the way it is and it can't be changed. Talk about some of the history. We only have about a minute and a half left, but there's always been a battle over how these primaries selection process occurs. And it actually was after the 1968 Democratic Convention, when Hubert Humphrey won the nomination without winning a single primary, that a lot of the major changes have occurred.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the modern system where primaries actually matter is fairly new and was created in the 70s. The issue here, well, I'll tell one particular piece of history, and this is in 2004. Howard Dean was the front runner for most of that Democratic primary. And then shortly before the Iowa caucuses began, a video clip emerged of him criticizing the Iowa caucus from before he was even a presidential candidate. And that was when the momentum shifted. I mean, I don't know if there's a causal relationship there or not, but I do know that clip was played constantly in Iowa media. He was attacked relentlessly for it, and he wound up taking third. So if you are a presidential candidate, I don't blame Elizabeth Warren for being evasive about things, because Iowa will punish you if you come after that first in the nation status. And it's a problem because it's not good for the Democratic Party to have this unrepresentative state constantly be first in line.
So you now have Julian Castro, who's not going to make it to tomorrow night's debate. The top four candidates are all white, yet there is a diverse group of candidates for the Democratic Party. At the start of October, the Charleston Post and Courier found Buttigieg had no black voter support in South Carolina, just 4% support overall. But now this poll shows he is almost 10% ahead of all other candidates in Iowa.
Right. Now, I mean, I will caution about that poll. I'm old enough to remember when Herman Cain was the front runner for the Republican nomination. So there's often, when you see a lot of movement in the polls, it just means that people are undecided. But yes, I mean, Buttigieg is a candidate who seems to appeal very well to the white electorate in Iowa.
We're going to have to leave it there. Ian Millhiser, senior correspondent for Vox, and Gilberto Hinojosa, chair of the Texas Democratic Party. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Stream Democracy Now!'s impeachment coverage at democracynow.org.